I'm Coach Tarek.
And I'm Vanessa.
And I'm Paul.
We are your movement experts, and we are here to educate health and fitness professionals with the tools to create real change for and within the industry.
Hey guys, Paul here from Purpose Driven Movement. Today, I've got Vanessa here, where we're going to discuss her recent podcast she just had with another person in the podcast, Tarek. Vanessa, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm really good at thinking back to our conversation, and I'm glad I get to tell you how awesome it was.
Well, of course it was. You were there. Seriously, what did you guys cover on the podcast?
It was challenging to kind of narrow the topic for sure, but we talked about actually the name of our podcast, Purpose Driven Movement, and where it comes from, because Tarek has been the brains of so many businesses in the industry. We go deep into his foundations, what he did starting out in his career, how he molded himself, which I think is a really great example for anyone in the industry who's looking to sort of see how they can grow and progress, or how they might change roles throughout the industry, which is really cool. And we talk about a little bit of movement stuff. We go into, what are some important foundations for movements, for coaches, and just for general people in life, and how we can start to systemize that.
That's very cool. I'm really interested to hear some of his wisdom and his ideas on career progression, because that's something a lot of trainers really struggle with. They start off as, I'm a trainer, but what do I do? It's not like the only idea is to open a gym, which I know Tarek's done, but he's also worn so many other hats. I think that's probably going to be a really interesting thing for, I work with Tarek as well, and he wears a ton of hats. So that'll be a really interesting thing for the listeners to take something away from.
Yeah, he's so interesting, and every time I learn, we're friends, and I still learn so much about him talking through that. So I can't wait for you guys to all hear it.
It'll be very exciting. Looking forward to it.
Hi there. Welcome back to Purpose Driven Movement. I'm your host today, Vanessa. So great to have you back here with me. And today, I'm really excited because I get to interview one of our co-hosts. I have the pleasure of having Tarek with me. Hey, Tarek, how are you?
Hey, Vanessa. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this one.
And I seem to be finding a little bit of rhythm with my interviews. Not one of my interviewees so far has any idea of the questions that I'm asking them, so you're no exception.
I'm contemplating.
Everyone who's following along, I have a book here in my hand. If you're watching along, this book is called Purpose Driven Movement, a System of Functional Training. And it is actually co-written by the lovely Tarek that we have here. Now, Tarek, what led you to write Purpose Driven Movement?
Yes. And if you've had a bit of a guess on the association with the podcast, there you have it in clear giveaway. Vanessa, it was about 2012 where Dan and I had already been 3 years or even 4 years at that time into operation with the then Sydney Kettlebells, which evolved into the Australian Institute of Kettlebells into Functional Training Institute. What we did want to do is really conceptualize our system, our framework. And that was really key for us, was to really understand our philosophies, put it into a system, and have that readily available for everyone out there, especially those who are doing our programs. They'd have a book of the foundational elements, and then to spread the word as far as we can. So that's really what inspired it. And we had a strategy session with a guy named Stephen Bossman, who had done some really good things in the fitness industry himself. We had a day strategy at his house, and that was so pivotal, Vanessa, to really fleshing out the 5 pillars, the adaptive functional training system, which then led, obviously, to the chapters and the structure of the book. We had planned at that point, fast forward, 2 years, that was 2013, 12, 13, 14. We'd still been writing, and then it sort of stopped. The project stopped. We sort of let it be. Other things got in the way. We got busy doing business. And so the book became, there was a roadblock, and so getting busy led to the book being parked. At the time, it was probably 30% complete. At that point, we put proposals through Human Kinetics, and that didn't get accepted. And we eventually found a self-publication company called Grammar Factory at the time. And we then hired them to carry on the project. And I said to Dan, look, I'm going to take reins of this. We really need to get the book out. Something just prompted me. I just felt like this needed to be done, So that spark inside led me to sort of take the project on further. So we're looking in 2016 and 17. I was traveling, teaching, living in Malaysia at the time, and in between every break of teaching and going into another country, I'd be at the airports writing. I'd be, at nighttime, at the hotel riding, it was an infatuation. I had the energy to do it. And eventually by March 2019, we released the book. So it did take a little while, but hey,
Well, that was part of one of the questions I was going to ask you. It was like, it takes time to write a book. I kind of knew how busy you'd been over those years. And so it's a hefty little book. It's got some great stuff in there. And yeah, thanks for that story. It's great. I'm interested in a couple more things. So one of your titles up in the top here, so I'm just coming through, in your introduction, it's called The Problem of Dysfunctional Functional Training. And I was just wondering if you could delve a little deeper into what that meant.
Well, look, I think you and I are movement practitioners, and of course, it's sort of like that adage: if you've got the ladder on the wrong board, right, and you're trying to climb, and then eventually your destination is not there. It's kind of the same thing. Like if you're training up a client to become better at a specific skill, right? So let's just say if they're wanting to compete in kettlebell lifting and they haven't got the foundations and they haven't got the technical movements correct, then when they get to competition, they're probably going to be failing, right? So that's the whole idea. We don't want to dysfunctionally set up our clients or athletes for a poor end result, because as we know, the magic is in the process. It's in the journey. And so it's not we need to be perfected, but in how we then design a program, for example. But it's identifying the specificity for that particular client, seeing where their erroneous movements occur, due to what reasons, and really understanding that with what we call the talk-see-do approach. So really understanding the questionnaires don't become questionnaires, they become a talk, because that really breaks down that barrier of, hey, I'm assessing you, and you're actually a human being to a human being. So having that conversation and almost sort of having a meta conversation where you go deeper into their actual goals, getting deeper into their frames, their limitations, it was really important to then going, well, that's probably why there's a dysfunction there, was because, you this repetitive movement doing this particular hobby, right? It could have been, doing some gardening, and every time you're doing gardening, you were leaning down this way and you were rotated, and, you didn't balance it out. You didn't use your right hand, right, to kind of shovel the earth or whatever it may be in your gardening venture. So that's one aspect of it, of course. And then, of course, from the coach's perspective or the trainer's perspective is really understanding, the proper mechanics, right? Biomechanics. So when you're looking at primal patterns, how are they effectively executing it themselves? And understanding the nuances of those primal patterns, which could then cause dysfunction because the client doesn't know better, let's say, right? Where we're assuming, and that'd be the dangerous walk, right? That the trainer and coach with their client can go on, if that makes some reasonable sense.
Well, you started to talk into there about biomechanics and dysfunction, regular movement patterns that people have throughout their day. If people wanted to understand the main message from your book, is that kind of where it's going? Or would you say is the why behind the book and the message that you wanted to impart on people?
Yeah, that's one element of it. There's other aspects. It's broken up into how to assess, how to coach, how to move, and how to program. So really, it's looking at like integrating, really understanding the integrative approach that a coach and trainer coming out of their Cert 4 or coming out of their formative, days, the becoming of a trainer, it's essential to have a foundation and a system, hence why we call it a system of functional training. This doesn't mean that this is the only aspect or way of functional training. We've never said that in the book. What we've said is all trainers, coaches need to have a system to follow that they can broaden and build off. It's like science with theories. Theories aren't like just there forever. Like they're to be challenged, tested, refined, broadened out, built upon, maybe dismissed, right? Even it's the same kind of mindset that we certainly adopted. Our intention, at least, was when we're writing that book, was to not dismiss other theories out there, but to really provide a system, Vanessa, framework to understanding the 5 pillars, which is to restore function, which is pillar 1, looking at incorporating proper body weight systems, applications, primal patterns. Then we can start to load the client's foundations, and we teach the parameters in and around what loading is, how we can load, the implements that we can use. Into pillar 4, then we can start to add more elements of strength and power, not just one-dimensionally. We can then start to broaden out in the 5th pillar where we integrate complex functional patterns. So really getting a sense of that client journey through this system. And then from there, we really focus in on ongoing assessing and coaching, how to really be present, which you're big on as well, how to really be present with the client.
That's awesome. It's such a great explanation. I really love everything that you've kind of mentioned through there, because it sounds like a really holistic approach to training, to being with your clients. And I think that when you come out of your Cert 3, Cert 4, I definitely felt that way when I did. And I had an exercise science degree to back me up as well. I didn't know where to start with some clients. It was really challenging. You were almost in the dark. You were blindly kind of following maybe what you thought you should do, and that wasn't always necessarily correct. And then some clients who you thought you could really help ended up leaving you, and it was all really challenging. And I think that providing a system, particularly when you're, like you said, finding your feet, so important.
It really is. And then, finding a structure within that system and going, what does assessment mean, and how to assess with what we call assess with purpose? What are some elements that can be included into that framework? And then coaching, how do you effectively coach and communicate to clients around assessment, around the programming? And that segues into move with practice. How do you then move with purpose using the 5 pillars approach into then how does one program with purpose? And so that's really tying it all together. And then, as you say there, it's flexible and flowing. Once you've got that foundation, that needs to be applied specifically to those clients. And my friend Nick Tuminello, who you know as well, Vanessa, he said it brilliantly. He said, for example, programming principles are universal, but designing the workouts is specific. You know what I mean? So it's really, that's the key there, is going, well, these universal principles doesn't mean that it's applied to every single human being in the same way.
Hey guys, I'm Paul Meldrum, one of the hosts of Purpose Driven Movement and also one of the founders of Fitwell Continuing Education. What we do is we provide an online platform for fitness professionals to learn everything they need to know about wellness, about movement, and about business development. In our program, we help you navigate through life as a personal trainer and give you the tools that you need to make sure that this career becomes a long-lasting, successful one for you. And as a special thank you to all the listeners of Purpose Driven Movement, we'd like to offer you a free 7-day trial. Simply give us your details, your name, email address, and phone number, and we'll get you set all up. No credit card required.
If you currently are looking for a PT or a coach to train you, what are some of the qualities that you're looking for in that coach?
Experience, of course, a few different coaches and especially more in sporting and other areas, like done some martial arts. So I've sought out coaches in and around those areas. So for me, I look at them as a practitioner, their experience, but also them, can I connect with them? So I like to have conversations, see if I connect with them, because that's massive. For me, if I'm not able to connect with that coach, that trainer, then how am I going to spend this intimate time, right? Like, all of a sudden it just becomes, that environment, that space becomes uncomfortable, right? And certainly I want to avoid that. I want that space to be special so that, whatever comes from it is true creativity, and it becomes a more adherence and adoption to learning. So that's what I look to is the person intrinsically, but also the environment, right? And they all come together to then help with learning outcomes. So that's sort of how I do it. More specific these days, I look for specialized folk in who are maybe accomplished and maybe general in their fitness, but also have a specialization as well. So yeah, it depends. For me, that's different. Whereas someone may simply want to get back and hit those components of fitness,
Particularly apart when you mentioned how intimate that space can be between a trainer and a client, because sometimes my clients will tell me things that they don't tell their partners or their friends or anyone else, because it's a safe space. It's an environment that you create where you have that trust, and that's so important.
It really is. And that's where we've had a conversation about this in our first, we touched on it in our first webinar with Paul, is that emotional intelligence and really understanding how to coach and communicate is important. Because look, the trainer, the coach isn't a psychologist, of course. There's parameters. However, because it's a human element, even if it's online, right? Like let's face it, if it's in person or online, that connection really needs to be optimized through really conveying character strengths, understanding how to communicate with them, emotional regulation, and therefore like goal setting and all of those things become a lot more purpose driven as a result, because you're understanding the person's needs at a deeper level, right? Without going too deep, all of a sudden you're opening up some base that potentially you're not meant to, or even trained to.
So I have this theory that all of the clients or people who want to partake in the fitness industry, want to be coached, who essentially want a trainer, I have this theory that I think that they should interview their trainer. And I don't know how you feel about that, but I wanted to get your take on, number one, how you, what you thought of that approach, and maybe some questions that people who are engaging in fitness, in training, should ask their coaches.
Yeah, it's a very good point. It's a very good approach, I would say. What I would say to that, Vanessa, is, that whole saying, when the student is ready, the teacher will show up, I think is really important. So what that can mean a number of things, but that old proverb is really meaningful, because when the student is ready, therefore, they're going to be a lot more engaged, right? So really qualifying, it goes two ways. I think it's bi-directional. So coach, the trainer, qualifying that client is very important, I believe. And if you're going to be spending 1, 2, 3, 4 sessions a week potentially with them over a series of weeks or months or even years, that's really important, I feel, because that connection piece, like we discussed earlier, is going to manifest potentially in a positive or a negative way, depending on that selection. So that's number one. But number two, what you said, if we look at the opposite direction, I believe then the client interviews the coach. Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought of it like that.
Well, it's something that I've been thinking about, because your book talks about systems, and it inspired me to think about how we could bring more people into the fitness industry. And I thought that if there was a way for people who want to engage with coaches to feel more at ease, to even start to talk to a trainer. I don't know about you. I don't know if you've ever had this experience in your training career. I've been interviewed by several clients before. Quite literally sat down, big box gym at reception, and they grilled me on my expertise, on my what I was going to do, how I was going to plan their training, absolutely every detail. And I actually quite enjoyed the process, because it made me really think about the best approach for them as well. And it was a really interesting conversation. And for that kind of foundational trust, that client can either take it or leave it straight away. You're either connecting with them before you even start, or you're like, okay, what she said was probably correct. That sounds good, but it doesn't really sound like I want that.
Is that more of an informal thing? Yeah, that just sort of impromptu came up with some particular type of clients who are very detailed?
Very detailed. They were very detailed oriented, but it got me thinking.
That's interesting. And then what you're suggesting is there's a way, not to rigidly, but to maybe see that in and offer that. Would that be more like an offer?
Yeah. I reckon, I'm just putting out an idea for any trainer, any coach out there. Come back to us and say, hey, I have a great idea of facilitating conversations between trainers, coaches, and the general public, so that we can break down some barriers.
Well, yeah, that could be if you frame the questions and you said hey, I want you now to interview me, because I feel like this can establish a greater connection and appreciation of each other. And then you frame the questions, Vanessa, and what training style or whatever it may be. You get into more details, but get general to more detailed. Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's a little good framework there, folks. There's a system.
This is why we do this. All right. Here's maybe a tricky question. What does functional training mean to you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, in the book, we don't have a specific. As you go through the book, it's going to reveal itself more, and then all of a sudden the reader has a better understanding rather than a definitive small definition. One preface to it, if I was to say what functional training is, it's quite debatable yet, and it is studied in scientific circles now, the last sort of 10, 15 years, more rigorously, just like your traditional strength and conditioning modalities. And it's kind of an interesting one, I will say, is because if we look at the kettlebell as a tool, right, I've used that for many, many years, and we created our first kettlebell course in 2008, released in 2009, which was one of the first accredited in Australia. That course itself, provided a way to understand something different than the traditional approach, because all of a sudden now you're not just doing these linear one-dimensional movements that you do with the barbell. The barbell's great, and I'm not going to get controversial here. It's going to give you more absolute strength, more absolute power, But now with a kettlebell, guess what? You can start to rotate with it. It stays proximal to the body. You can do so many things that would include strength, power, and provide and hit all the parameters of the notion of fitness, balance training, everything like that. Cardiovascular as well, the way that you program that tool. And that became known as a different way of training. Therefore, it became known as a functional tool. However, it is mainstream now. It's interesting. Most gyms now, at least in Australia, and the ones in Asia that I've been to and traveled through, got kettlebells as a staple, right? So they're not this rare commodity anymore. Is it therefore still a functional tool because now it's readily available? And I feel it is, and it's a conventional tool now. That's the interesting thing, that functional doesn't mean it's unconventional. I think that's really what I wanted to really clarify. And this is interesting. I thought about this a lot. Functional can be that, but it transcends that. It can be conventional as well. And I feel that the kettlebell now is a conventional tool. It's not an unconventional tool. When we say unconventional, that could be, throwing chains and walking around with chains, for example. Flipping tires can be regarded as being unconventional. Those type of things that aren't common practice. However, I don't feel that really ties to a definition of functional training being an uncommon practice. Broadening this out, I hope this is okay. Now, the other typical elements will say that, it's all about being three-dimensional and everything. Well, not necessarily, because you still need a foundation in the sagittal plane. There still needs to be an understanding that a common stance, what we call a hip width stance, is typically where you'd have your barbell and a lot of your movements. When we say functional, we change those stance and variations. You need to really understand that initially you need the shoulder width stance. Initially, you need to work into sagittal plane. As you know, it's those micro structures that help with that foundation. So functional is foundational, but functional also then transcends foundational and would say that we can then work in different planes of motion, and therefore different vector forces start to come into the fray, as well as moving. A lunge pattern isn't exclusive to functional. A lunge, you can lunge with anything you want. A squat it's a functional movement, right? So therefore, having a kettlebell doesn't make it more of a functional movement than if you had a barbell on your back or in rack position. And that could be any type of implement. What it will say to that is, if we did have a kettlebell, we're not going to just hold it symmetrically. We're going to hold it now asymmetrically, hold it off center, which is completely different. So now it does draw in different components of fitness, which isn't traditionally done if the common method is to have something central, or such as a medicine ball or a kettlebell or a barbell. So it does start to play around with different positions in the positional implement. Being able to squat, therefore, is a squat, but when I'm squatting here versus if I had the kettlebell out a little bit more here, in a safe position, of course. So it starts to look at that. It starts to look at the variances of the stances only after that foundational components are met. And hence why we created that 5-pillar approach, is to really understand the importance of that. So it doesn't dismiss traditional strength and training. It really complements that. If anything, a lot of the Olympic lifters in Russia and in Eastern Europe at the time, or even potentially now they still do, would complement their barbell training with kettlebell training. That was always a known fact, right? So, did that mean that it certainly suggests that they didn't dismiss that, and nor should I feel the trainer too. Again, like as we know, a trainer, it's very portable, like a kettlebell and ball. But there's a portability, therefore make it more functional. To a degree, it does. It's hard to take a barbell everywhere, right? For example. So hopefully that kind of opens up. I don't want to give a clear one sentence definition. What I did want to do is just invite people to sort of think more deeply, philosophize on a little bit, which I've done, evidently for a long time. Functional training can be adapted and utilized for anyone, So does that therefore make it more functional if you regress something or adapt it and modify it? No, it doesn't. That's really a programming principle. So that's the key element here, is to really understand that these different tools, I mean, if you create, the Y Bell, or you create any other product, does that make it more functional? No, it doesn't. It doesn't at all. So it might broaden out the array of implements that are out there, but all of those implements, the net effect of those are there's a degree of functionality to all of them, specific to those, tantamount to those clients' needs.
I like it. I like you're like a philosopher who's done a lot of training and been around a lot of gyms for forever. So it's a really unique perspective that you have in the fitness industry. And I find that philosophy and questioning of practices of what we do is so important to being able to evolve and to grow. It also comes back to the client as well. Like you said, just because you're doing something with a kettlebell doesn't necessarily make it functional for the person that you have in front of you. And I always love chatting to, specific programming nerds, you included, about this word functional, because I feel like it started off with it was really exciting to be involved in functional training, and then it got demonized because it got muddied almost.
It's sort of like the seesaw, went one way to one extreme to another. And so what's the middle ground here is to look at both sides of, let's say, debate or argument, whether they're well articulated or not, and, well thought out even, right? So I think it's important that we don't become tribal, I think, and functional potentially did become, or even can become even still to this day, tribal. Yeah, you've got like functional patterns. Okay, they're doing a great job. However, it doesn't mean that they're the standout when it comes to understanding functional training and understanding how functional training complements traditional strength and conditioning. And a lot of now coaches in the strength and conditioning field in performance space are adopting these different tools. So it doesn't mean that they're rigid, right? And that's where, philosophies and being closed-minded around one's methods, it can be quite dangerous. However, I would also say, on the other hand, being too open and trying this and that without having a solid grounding or base is also detrimental. If you're going to pursue strength and conditioning, pursue it full-heartedly, or functional training, pursue it full-heartedly, understand it, the inside out, but then be appreciative of other methodologies. Yeah, does that make sense? So really have a firm foundation first before being too flagrant. So it can go to those extremes, I think, Vanessa, quite easily.
Well, it's not a question that I wrote down, but I'm going to ask it anyway because you went there. You mentioned there, not to go too deep or too intense in one path. We see this a lot in the industry. We see the polarization of different sects of the industry because they believe that their way of doing it is the best way to do it. What's your theory as to why some people get into that rabbit hole, and why is your approach in the middle field?
Yeah, look, I still think, to reiterate, it's definitely a firm foundation. So if you're a strength conditioning coach, really understand that well, or as I was mentioning, a specialized aspect of that. If you want to really get good at the barbell, then do some relevant courses that by experts, Australia Weightlifting Foundation, for example, and others of reputation. So I do think that it's important to really not necessarily just have a middle ground approach all the time, but really understand both sides and be appreciative of what good aspects of functional training or methodologies that stem from functional training. And there'll be methodologies that stem from strength and conditioning, to then not get too tribal. I think it's the tribalism, Vanessa, that tribal aspect, that perhaps there's an element of fear there, fear that this method could be, we don't want to prove this method wrong because it's helped me, for example, it's helped all my clients become super successful. Therefore, that case study as a tribe, as my tribe, therefore is good for everyone. That's the big problem when all of a sudden one's, subjective experience becomes objective reality. So it becomes a disassociation. Hopefully that's not getting too deep, but all of a sudden, and that can become collective in a tribe where then a multitude of other people have that same mentality that our methodology can't be breached, our methodology isn't erroneous, our methodology is better than other methodologies. So it becomes an us versus them, which is a clear trait of tribalism and a clan.
I mean, I like it. That's a great way to break it down. And I think it's a surefire way when we're talking to other coaches and when we're talking to other trainers, just to be wary of people who say that this is the only way to do it. And it's not to say that their way has no merit or is wrong. It's always taking that cautionary approach to understand it from different aspects, right?
Yeah. And then one of our taglines early on with then Australian Institute of Kettlebells was, we were the education behind the equipment, the why behind the equipment. And I think if the coach and the trainer can understand, I use these they're really one and the same, but we can get into another conversation around coach and trainer later. I think that's really important as well, is to really understand that element of it. So yeah, I think going on that tribalism mentality and really understanding that, look, there are other perspectives out there and we could potentially learn from one another. However, I feel, Vanessa, it's important to note that the character strengths, really understanding your mission and your character strengths as a person, and then your business practice, your coaching practice, and what it represents is really equally important. And that provides really the stand on which your brand then stems from which becomes problematic when all you go is, I stand against this, I stand against them, right? Like if you stand for something and you're really clear in articulating your character strengths and your mission, guess what? That's great for your branding, you know? So I think that element is just as important as how technically brilliant you may be, you know?
I've been to a lot of clubs recently, lots of different clubs, and it sounds like there is a trainer shortage, an instructor shortage in the entire industry. So for those who are around, what are some of the barriers that we're facing at the moment to try to help more people, to try to grow our business and get more people understanding why health and fitness is so good for them?
Because we can have everyone can have influences to even small degrees in their own families or communities, you know, and that could be conveying the importance of choices we make to consume certain foods or products, etc. But also leading by example and looking at opportunities to go out there and promote and exercise it, you know, in parks or, you know, make it more readily available. So I think there's something to be said about that. I wanted to note that. In terms of the trainer shortage, I don't know the full stats, but there's definitely a mass exodus, you know, during and post-COVID. And I think that scaring away, you know, you could understand people's fears and sentiments. I don't know the exact stats on it, but definitely that had a ramification. I know that from a few organisations here in Australia, for example. So that would be one factor. How do we entice people back into the industry? So the AQUAL, you know, the Australian national standards, which AIF as an institution promote, which not all RTOs, I'll note, do that. And I'm not going to be controversial here, but they follow that. What they've done is broaden out a 12-month journey. So whether that be mostly online or they do promote touch points for face-to-face, for example. So now that 12-month journey will bring out, I feel, a more well-rounded trainer. We touched on the importance of some mentorship in our first podcast. It certainly doesn't solve the issue of the shortage. It will, I think, increase the quality of the trainer. It doesn't increase the quantity. So, yeah, I don't have any clear answers around that. I feel that there needs to be better pathways. So those of you who are listening in on that, you know, listening on our first podcast, because we had some really good thoughts, certainly in and around the idea of ongoing mentoring and really having that quality trainer, you know, that comes out and says, or coach that says, I love this industry. I want to make a living out of it as well as loving it. Those two things together. And I think that's important, is really having those organizations, even government support in actually facilitating and promoting fitness, health and well-being, but also promoting pathways for people to become a fitness wellness trainer of sorts. Yeah, I think it's important, Vanessa. I mean, I think we need to solve that really at that level.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to see some more government support for our industry in terms of, you know, we're not classified allied health, but we're so integral to the lives of so many people, and we could be integral to influence so much change across the population. It feels like as an industry, we're being underutilized when we could have a major influence under the right circumstance.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that's, we need to bridge that. And we always talk about allied health, bridging the gap, and to not even regard personal trainers in that category, I think is questionable. However, you know, these RTOs now are setting the standard for 12 months, and then there's more in-depth pathways. Then I feel that there could be a serious push, you know, at a government level to then bring allied health. And that would bring an amazing amount of opportunities and entice people to come into the industry, because now they've got allied health pathways that are clearly defined, that trainers work within this scope of practice versus EPs versus physios. And so now it's not just the classic, you know, doctor physio. Now it's more dynamic than that, and it's a true, what I and I'm sure you feel is a true health model.
I was listening to a podcast called a guy called Dr. Rangan Chatterjee, and one of his main points that he loves to make is that he wants to see healthcare, because he's a GP, become more community based, and so more groups where people have the same issues or same ailments working together and talking them out and moving towards getting better. And I feel like the fitness industry is that. No one knows that we're that in that respect. No. And it's interesting. It's a great point. It's great to have like more functionally minded or functional medicine based GPs that are now coming out in that context. But I think the other thing I'd say to this is, I'd invite people not to simply think about personal training, fitness training as being in this gym space. I think that's one element, because people associate
better with environment? What about physical activity in nature? And therefore, I think tying into local councils will then open up events, whether they're group training classes, out in the park space, taking a group out for a wilderness trek, and maybe even taking some light equipment out there. And there's something to be said about that and the access and the appreciation of that too. So I feel that not hedging fitness and personal trainers as simply being a person who works within a gym space. And I think, I don't know, I feel that there's an important aspect there that we need to work toward.
I like your philosophizing brain. It's very exciting. All right. I mean, I can ask you questions for hours, but I won't. So if you listened to our first podcast, you would have heard this question. And Tarek, I've already asked you this question. So you get a chance to do it over, maybe change it if you want to, add to it. I don't know. Let's see where you go with it. However, if you could change one thing about the fitness and health industry as it stands right now, without any consequence, what would it be?
Yeah, like we touched on earlier, is personal trainers getting acknowledged as being allied health practitioners and having an influence on that. And I don't feel that's too far off. And I feel that would then allow more people to come in the industry knowing that it's truly professional.
Yeah, I like it. Amazing. Team, thank you for listening. We appreciate your time. Now, if you want a copy of Purpose Driven Movement, where do they get to go for that, Tarek?
Well, you can go on Amazon. You can go to Amazon and buy the book, but we'll also put a link in the show note. So you can buy it as a e-copy or as a physical copy as well. So I'm glad you're holding it as part of your bookshelf.
Yeah, it was living behind me, and I was like,
"Oh, right, collecting dust."
No. Look, it's even like, if you can't see, it's even got like highlighted bits in there as well.
Yeah, you're a real nerd. I like that.
I am a real nerd. I think as this podcast unfolds, you, the listener, will understand that you're the philosophizer, I'm the nerd, and Paul's the guy who doesn't like chest day.
Yeah, pretty much. That'll start to become more and more known. Yeah, good stuff.
I'm only joking. Thank you, Tarek, for having this chat with me. I really appreciate your time. And for you listening, have an excellent day. Take your time, enjoy yourself, and do something for you today.
We are so grateful for your support and for tuning in to our podcast. We know that many of you have friends or colleagues who would also benefit from our content, and we would be honored if you could share our podcast with them. Sharing on social media, email, or even talking about us to a colleague is such a huge help in getting our message out there. We truly appreciate your support, and we can't wait to continue to grow and connect with more people through our podcast.